Good evening, everyone. We are very pleased to welcome our speaker for today, Professor Luis Bettencourt. May I request Professor Pankaj Chandra, Chairman of Ahmedabad University, to introduce our speaker today. Thank you.
Well, good evening to all of you. For those of you who do not know about this lecture series, last year, Ahmedabad University and CEPT put together this lecture series to bring in people who are at the confluence of what Ahmedabad University does and what CEPT does. And the idea being to see how much of interdisciplinary thinking that crosses boundaries of disciplines where new knowledge is emerging can stimulate our thinking here. And we're delighted to have Professor Luis Bettencourt, who's the, as you can see, the Pritzker director, and of a very new institute at University of Chicago, the Mansueto Institute of Urban Innovation, amongst us. So welcome, and thank you very much for taking time to come to Ahmedabad. He's also a professor of ecology and evolution at the University of Chicago and an external professor of complex systems at Santa Fe Institute in the US. To surprise you all further, he was trained as a theoretical physicist, and where he received his PhD and has worked in statistical and high energy physics model of the early universe. And you can then extrapolate what this talk hopefully is going to bring from and where it might go in times to come. He has worked extensively on complex systems theory and on cities and urbanization in particular. His research emphasizes the creation of new interdisciplinary synthesis to describe cities in quantitative and predictive ways, informed by classical theory from various disciplines and the growing availability of empirical data globally. And as we were discussing this morning, there's a fair bit of, in his thinking, the coming together of the sciences, the computational resources that are available, data, as well as social sciences, humanities, etc. Just a sentence on the institute, the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation, and I think it should be interesting for all of us here in India who are trying to bridge this pathway of interdisciplinary learning. It's an institute that aims to bring together programs in the social, natural, and computational sciences and in the humanities to enhance the university's strength in urban scholarship and education. It was found to foster innovative and interdisciplinary scholarship, develop new educational programs, and provide leadership on issues that meet the challenges that cities face today. So it's such a pleasure to welcome Professor Luis Bettencourt. And the title of his talk is An Emerging Science of Cities and Its Significance to Sustainable Development. Professor Bettencourt.
Hello, everybody. So first of all, thank you very much for having me. I heard for a long time about Ahmedabad and what is happening here in the city, as well as some of the innovations in policy and transportation that has been happening here, and so I was very curious to see it firsthand. So it's great to be here, and I'm particularly grateful to CEPT and to Ahmedabad University for making this possible. We're also very interested in your model of education as also a way to bridge disciplines and create knowledge that's alive and that's vital in the problems that we're facing today. So as you already heard in the introduction, I've had a sort of a checkered history through the sciences and the humanities. And in some sense, this is a new adventure. It's an adventure that brings all this together to try to understand cities. The University of Chicago is mostly a liberal arts college, so we value theory and principled approaches to how things work. So we want to really understand sort of what is the theory of cities, how do cities work. But as you will see, critical in all that and critical in creating change that solves real problems is having good information and being close to people and understand their condition in cities. So this talk will be a little bit a grand tour of things we found through time, of a few problems, including what does it look to think about urban design in the context of a city like Ahmedabad, but cities that are moving and changing very quickly. And towards the end, a little bit of the applied work that we do in India, particularly having to do with redesign of informal settlements and slums. So I want to start sort of with the universe. You've been warned, right, that I had sort of this past history. And I don't know if, I think probably the older ones among you know what this photo is, but I'm not sure if everyone would know. I'll just say it. This is one of the most famous photos ever taken. It was the first photo that was taken of the Earth from moon orbit. So from outside the Earth. It was taken by Apollo 8 in 1968. And this photo, what's most important about it is, what became most important about it is not so much that we went to the moon, but it was really that we looked back at ourselves and got a change of perspective. So this photo is often credited really with the beginning of the environmental movement and the idea that, you know, it's all one Earth and we have to find a way to live together as well as to solve problems of sustainability, even as our societies change. So this is kind of an interesting photo that changed perspective, started a bunch of fields, particularly to do with the interface between human societies and ecology. But in many ways, it's not an actionable photo. So what I mean by that is that, what are you going to do with that? It's a whole planet, right? It's changing. It's very hard to know what to do beyond identifying a more holistic way of approaching these problems. About 20 or 30 years later, we started getting this kind of photo. So this photo is from 2012, but there's a history to these kind of photos of night lights, of looking back at Earth, but now, of course, on a zoomed-in scale. This is, of course, India, as you know, and you know where you are, around there. But the point is that when you start looking at the scale, you start getting a sense of what's causing the problems and the change, as well as the opportunity, which is the fact that actually human societies are not just all over the planet, of course, but they create these immense concentrations of people, as you see in the night lights, like, of course, Delhi is very visible, but here we are. But also more to the point, as I'll show you later, they create even stronger concentrations of something that you cannot quite see in this picture, which are resources, not just energy, but many other things. Resource flows into these places and some resources flow out, but especially things that are sort of human and have to do with the creation of economic value, such that the size of economies of each one of these cities, and systems of innovation, and of course of changing the built environment, which you know all about here. So what's happening here is that really there's a structural transformation in the way we live. And as you know, this is sort of obviously a poster child for what's happening in India. They'll become even more concentrated in many of these cities in the decades to come. And I'll say a lot more about that in a second. So I'm zooming in, right? So I'm getting closer. And this is a problem I think that many of you will have seen before. It's the problem of traffic, right? That's what planners often do, is they approach the problem of cities through that transportation systems. That certainly has been a classical approach, and I think some of you do it here. But this is Beijing, it's not sitting in India. But you know, we start seeing that obviously cities create these systems of movement that create many of their own problems, as well as their pollution and so forth. And as you keep going in, of course, cities get even more complicated. So cities have sort of this kaleidoscopic quality, right? That as you go in, you get closer to people and things get even more complicated, right? And in many ways, that's the paradigm for the kind of planning and the kind of understanding of cities that we need to be able to do, is to understand how cities actually work for us as people, but not so much in the day-to-day life that we experience, but sort of as a plan, as how life changes, as the physical environment changes, as all the things, it's the photo of Hong Kong, as all this information and economic activity that you see in these pictures that's so concentrated actually comes about and changes over time, right? So you're in the middle of starting to see this start to come in, not quite in this form in Indian cities, right? But this intensification of space, intensification of movement in traffic, more things happening, as development happens. And of course, Hong Kong is special. It has a special status among cities because it's been the city that's the densest place on earth. It was even denser in the 90s, had up to 1 million people per square kilometer. And probably maybe an Indian city will do that again, but probably no city will do that ever again. That was very difficult and had to do with particular things that Hong Kong could do, particularly very intense use of infrastructure and maintenance. And when you get closer, of course, you get to the problems of people and the problems of how lives change, what opportunities exist in city, of all the improvisation and sort of struggle that happens in cities, as well as opportunity that happens in cities. So this is for Rio, but you know, we'll be talking a little bit more about the informal nature of cities, how things get designed without a designer, right? Planned without a planner, but also the shortcomings of that process. And this is the very central to the condition of a lot of developing cities. They're just moving so fast that a lot of their fabric, or a lot of their lives, a lot of the ways in which they work has this bottom-up, very informal way that creates all kinds of problems, but at the same time is not easy to be dealt with by simple designs that sort of master plan the city. So how to solve that conundrum? So I already told you a lot about things that you know about how cities work, how they're structured, but sort of this zoom in, zoom out picture I find is very useful. And should you design at a small scale, should you design at a large scale, you know, what's the right way in? So let me just tell you a little bit about some of the things that cities do, and I think this will get us to a few other interesting things. So this Shanghai, many Indian cities are on a similar trajectory, but this is 25 years, okay, just 25 years of Shanghai and how, you know, they create this change. This is just the built environment, but you know everything that's changed in China with all the problems that Chinese urbanization has. It took 500 million people out of poverty. You're en route to do the same thing, but you're a little bit behind. So this is just amazing, right? This is something that's very difficult to do, which is to create this kind of change so quickly. So cities are special, especially for that property, is that they can create immense change very quickly. And so how does that happen is interesting to ponder a little bit. So let me tell you a little bit more. So this is sort of one of the standard measures of why cities are important in economic growth and human development. I'll tell you more about human development. This plot basically shows you the percentage of people that live in cities in different nations and GDP per capita, which, as you know, is a bit crass, but it's a measure of wealth. And what you see is that basically there's a general relationship. It goes up as this goes up. But once you're very urbanized, you can just go up and keep growing. But that's very hard to do here when you start. And in fact, this first beginning, if I had more countries here, you'd see it's very fraught with fluctuations and issues. And as you can see, India and China are particularly interesting because they're sort of on a trajectory here where, you know, if you bravely extrapolate India up here, maybe that way, you'll be richer than Japan, you know, with the same level of urbanization. That's very interesting. I know it doesn't always look like that when you walk out, but it's sort of interesting to ponder what you're starting to experience and where it could go. So I want to elaborate a little bit on that with some bit of provocation. I'm not sure if this is very clear, but I did this plot instead of borrowing that one I showed you before, and there are a bunch of countries here, China, India, which is sort of in this not so great color, but there you are. United States, Brazil, Indonesia. So these are countries that's fairly large, otherwise you wouldn't, I wanted them to be roughly comparable. But you see the difference. The United States is way out here, it's rich, right? And it's very urbanized. You have countries like Brazil that are interesting because they've had a lot of urbanization without growth, without much growth, okay? So a lot of urbanization in South America has been plagued with extreme inequalities and violence in cities, and so these cities are really struggling to realize their potential in terms of economic growth as well as other things. And then, you know, look at these two. These are most interesting. So there's China here, and then there's India. So you're kind of doing a little bit better than China was doing at the same period. And let me show you this one, which is slightly different. So this is now the number of people, urban population, not percentage, but total population. So India and China are over here on the right because they have hundreds of millions of people. And this is the same axis. But look at what you're doing. So you caught up with China, and your urbanization now for a while is delivering almost the same thing as India, that China has done, in a completely different model, as you know. So I find this most curious. I don't fully understand it. But the question really is whether you're going to go up like this or you're going to go like this with like Brazil. And this is why in many ways you cannot just take it for granted that things will happen. If you're going to become more like a rich developed country, you have to be able to do better even than China is doing and follow a trajectory that's steeper. So what does that look like, and what's implied in that? It sort of raises a set of interesting questions. So let me now complement a bit this picture, which has just been about economic quantities, with other pictures, which I think are also interesting, because what urbanization delivers, I was trying to convince you with those first pictures, is not just money, but all kinds of things all at once, both good and bad. So what you're seeing here is something that's called the Human Development Index, and it's inspired by almost maybe the most important piece of work in economics, arguably of the 20th century, by Amartya Sen, as you know, as an Indian economist. And he was struggling with the problem of what change in human societies look like and how to measure development instead of just measuring with money, as I was showing you before. How would you do that? So this index measures money, but also measures education and health. So two other important dimensions that are relatively easy to measure, at least in nominal terms. And so what you find here are different countries, so from the most developed by this index to the least developed. And what you find here, so you can only go to 1 in this index, but 1 is good and 0 is bad. And what you have here is a line for countries. This is countries, the blue. And this is a line for large cities within those countries. And so what you take from this that's very interesting. So here's India. That's the plateau for India. So still a fairly low level of development overall, but look how high your cities are compared to that value. So a lot of what's happening, and this, as you can see, is characteristic from almost every nation except nations that have civil wars and horrible things happen, is that somehow cities are, by these measures, delivering these things before the nation does. So in some sense, they're the places where these processes are happening first, and by where they start spreading to the rest of the country. So that in some sense, what you're seeing in Ahmedabad or in Mumbai or in Delhi, good and bad is sort of a preamble to a transformation that's going to be spreading over India, and therefore what will happen next in these places is very important in determining what will happen everywhere. So this is a very sort of, all this that I'm showing you is the kind of things that we've only been able to measure in the last 10 years, and that making sense of cities, but at the same time, we don't fully understand these processes of transformation. Let me give you a few other examples. This is a bad one, and this has to do with energy consumption and urbanization. This is for China, which of course, as you know, has had a very energy-intensive kind of urbanization. Now they're trying to change that. But this means basically, it's a complicated graph, but it means that as you urbanize, even as large cities sometimes save a little bit of energy through transportation systems, there are public transit and so forth, societies, as they get richer, tend to spend a lot of energy and therefore have a lot stronger emissions. So that's something that India, in some sense, because you're coming late to the process, cannot really do, or not only because it's a problem for you in terms of your air quality and pollution, but because this will probably take us over the edge in terms of sustainable development for the rest of the world in terms of climate change. So it's a real challenge that in many ways, not only do you have to do better, you have to do it also differently in terms of the urbanization ahead of you. And just to complement this big picture now of a few things that happen, what you find here, this is a little bit old, but one of the problems with Indian cities is that we don't have a lot of quantitative information and data to make these kind of statements. This is from a World Bank study from a while ago, and this is basically electrical access, which of course is going up and in many places is almost complete. But as you see, Indian cities, so you know what this classification means, I think, the large cities tend to have more electrical access, and of course there's a big gap to rural areas. But the same thing tends to be true also of water access, for example. This is true of many other countries like South Africa, Brazil. We had a recent paper about this, but this is just to show. And this plot just quickly shows that basically as you start creating public connections and proper infrastructure, there are tremendous economies of scale in terms of the cost of delivering water to people. So a lot of people in the informal, if they're getting their data through informal services, they actually are probably paying a lot, a cost that can be reduced, but also probably a consumption that will increase as that cost comes down. But all this is latent in many Indian cities, and it's a question of what will happen next. Okay, so I want to now make a point, hopefully, to the planners among you and the architects among you, in terms of how we've come to reconceptualize what urban planning looks like. And then I want to tell you a little bit how cities work, and then go to more practical issues towards the end. So, you know this, of course, very iconic. It's sort of the icon of modernist architecture and how to do urban planning according to that model. It's Le Corbusier Vilhadios. It's partly what he thought should be done for Paris. It wasn't quite, but if you see the video, at some point there's a video of him presenting this sort of plans, and he's going over Paris, and he's just erasing it and putting the stuff up. So, you know, I think even the most hardcore architect would probably think that this is not a good city, right, for all kinds of reasons. Partly because it's putting density in wrong places. It's just creating a lot of residential density, but not interaction density. It's dedicating most public spaces to cars, which creates a lot of induced demand. It would create a lot of pollution. But in some sense, this was a time at which people thought that purely from the genius of one person, pretty much, and thinking about the technology available at the time, they create an ideal design that could shape society. It was bad science in terms that this had no good social science whatsoever or economics. And also, of course, it was basically wrong in terms of not paying attention for how people live, and therefore how those livelihoods could be enhanced rather than completely reconfigured. But in some sense, this stays with us in the logic of master planning and creating things on large scales quickly. And much of the urbanization in China, if you see it, comes still along this model, which creates a lot of issues and probably only works in a society that really has economic activity that's concentrated, that's structured on a very large scale. This is sort of, we were talking about this a little bit before, and this is sort of another poster child for smart cities in this case. You know, you're in the middle of sort of a smart cities challenge that we were discussing a little bit. This is kind of, Indian smart cities are nothing like this, right? Let's even say that to begin with. But what you're seeing here is Masdar city, which is it was a city that was to be built in the Emirates, where of course one has a lot of money. And it was the perfect city in terms of engineering, in terms that everything was integrated. It was a zero emission city. But you know, there are no people, as there were no people before in the plot before. And you know, it looks like a mall and so forth. These things look like fun, right? They don't look anything like modes of transportation in India, right? Maybe the metro. But you know, they spew out these rays. But basically this is a completely idealized utopia, right? It's just the utopia of our day with the technology of our day, but it's very similar to the one before. And this again, it was to be built, but is not going to be built anymore. It's sort of a sad looking office space. And the point about this is that this is not a city, right? This is just a massive technology and engineering project. And that's not in the nature of cities. This is more like a city. This is a city, it's Rio. It could be India, but I decided you know better about India. I'm not going to show a lot of photos of specific places in India. But you know, it's informal, it's built by hand. You know, parts of Ahmedabad maybe not so colorful, but look a little bit like this, the more permanent ones. But this is how a lot of urbanization is happening. And this is a market in Lagos, completely informal. But this is the opposite, right? Where the first one was essentially the fully engineered city where nothing happens, but everything's perfect. This is the city where everything's improvised. It kind of works, but it's a tough place to live. It's a tough place to grow up. It's a tough place to be female, etc. But it's probably better than another place in Nigeria. This Lagos is very important because it's the only city at the moment, I'll show you in a second, but that's projected, it's one of the few cities, I should say, that's projected to be larger than Indian cities by the end of the century. Almost every other city that's large is Indian. But Lagos is the exception. It may get to 70 million people by the end of the century if it keeps growing this way. It's probably a wrong projection, but you have to imagine how does this get to be a 70 million people city. So here's that slide actually. So I want you to, if you don't know this, if you know it already, it won't surprise you. But there are people that try to make projections for the population size of cities in the next few decades. These include a bunch of things, including estimates of migration, as well as, very importantly, the demographic transition, so how many kids people will have. But what should be very clear is that while the large cities in India, like I just highlighted the largest, so Mumbai and Delhi, are already very large. This is 2025, so this is a few years from now. The point is that they'll become the largest cities at a scale of 40 and then 50 million people or 60 million people by the mid-century, right? So this has never been done before. We never had a city larger than Tokyo. Tokyo is a little bit below 40 million people. We don't know how to create a city this big. We don't know what it will look like, but it's in your hands, right? So you're going to do it either you want it or not. So it's an interesting challenge as to what it's going to look like. You can also see Lagos is projected to be this big, but the point is that these cities get to a scale that we've never seen before. And so it's completely uncharted territory. And the point is that that model of planning that China has used and that we've used in the past, that produces cities very quickly and solves very quickly problems of sanitation and transportation, is in some sense not available to you. It's not available to you because of your politics, not available to you because of the cities you have, but it's also not available to you because I think we've shifted what we want from urban planning. This is from the New Urban Agenda, which is sort of the international agreement on what we want from cities going towards the future, and I just highlighted a couple things, but the idea, many of these ideas have to be said, they have been incubated and generated by studying and working in Indian cities. The idea is that in part, you know, everyone should have a right to the city, people should be integrated and have opportunity in cities, and that we should thinking about a vision and a vision of design that somehow starts with people, very much like Amartya Sen insisted, and thinks about opportunities that people have in cities. So what that means is that it implies that we have to know a lot about people, right? Which certainly the classical planner didn't have to know a lot about people. And we have to know a lot about other sciences and technologies such that you can pull off this mission. So a lot of what we're trying to do in Chicago is create an environment where people with different skills can learn from each other. I'll say more towards the end. So it is in this, when you look at the city from the perspective of a person, I use this slide particularly in a talk I gave in Singapore where things are still quite engineered, but they also have a practical sense of things. And somehow this is the one that clicked, is when you think about all the problems that we're trying to solve from a perspective of what someone experiences in their everyday life, then things get complicated, but they also get integrated and become a different kind of problem. Okay? And, you know, people all over the world using technologies for the United States, is a study I was involved in to former President Obama, trying to find ways in which we find some solutions, or at least some methods, to deal with these issues through technology. So part of the idea is that it's already there. We use it for transportation, to catch an Uber or to know where the metro is coming or whatever. We use it to meet people and not waste so much time. But part of the question is, are there ways in which we can have the information that we need and generate designs that are more adaptive, more open-ended by using the kind of technology that we have now? It's sort of an interesting, if you think about the history of technology and the history of cities, that when, at the time of modernism, about 100 years ago almost, we were thinking about using industrial methods, methods of mass construction to build cities, right? Those are the high technologies of that time. And in many ways, the city is not about that. It's about information, relationships between people, and how space is structured. And maybe this time is different, and we have now technologies that are closer to that kind of process that can enhance those processes and make them work better. But this is something we don't know how to do. At its best, and we've talked both critically and optimistically about it, I think some of the things that India is starting to do about smart cities have to do with trying to explore these possibilities. So as part of sort of the message from this part, I just want to say that if you want to be a modern urban planner in terms of creating a city that's inclusive in the day that we live in, you have to know a lot of things. I think at CEPT I was learning a little bit that you structure your education like this. I think this is also the sphere of Ahmedabad University more generally. But you have to know science in terms of knowing social sciences, economic sciences. You have to know data and how to deal with evidence. You need to know about environmental science. You need to know about technology. Of course, much of this is now embedded, but some of it is not. And you have to be able to access people and pool knowledge together and try things in cycles that are iterative. So this is a completely different kind of job prescription than in the past, I think. And so we need to find networks that support each other and that build knowledge that allows us to do this. Okay? So now, having said all this, which are things that I think you knew, I want to tell you a little bit about what we've learned in the last 10 years or so about how cities work. So these are pretty general things that are more aggregate than what I was showing you, but I think set the stage a little bit for things that then will come later. Okay. So again, I talked to this problem of many things being integrated. This is a quote by Jane Jacobs, who was very famous in the United States. But this idea goes back a long time in urbanism. For example, in the work of Patrick Geddes, when he was trying to plan in Indian cities, again, a century ago, he was very much approaching it in this sense. So one of the issues is cities are complex systems, and much of what you see is that when you look into a city, people are different, neighborhoods are different, there are rich and poor people, there are people of all kinds, cultures, preferences, and so that's an issue. Once you go to a perspective more based on people, you have to deal with that issue. Everything's connected, as we said. I'll show you a little bit about scaling, which is that in some sense, as cities get larger, their qualities change. And this is one of the most distinctive properties of cities that you can play to as you plan. And another problem that's kind of interesting from a point of view of solutions is this problem of what I call their circular causality. So let me ask you a question and you get the sense of this. Is a city rich because it has good infrastructure, or does it have good infrastructure because it's rich? Okay. Is it fair? Is it a just and fair city because it has good institutions, or does it have good institutions because it's fair? You know, you get the sense, of course, we know the answer, but the answer is not just one thing follows from the other. These things develop in tandem and keep improving with each other, or the other way around, right? And so what happens in causality, the causality of these systems, we're talking a little bit about this, about capturing value from infrastructure interventions that then feeds back to improving services. These processes actually are self-reinforcing, either positive or negative ways. But this is not often the spirit of policy or of economic theory that goes with them. So in some sense, you need to have enough information and understand processes well enough that you can play to this circular causality and then leave these processes open-ended, which is what development means. So in a lot of my early work, what I tried to do is to really look, the ambition really is to look at every city in the world, including Indian cities, which is still hard, and try to compare them and find their properties. And what you find, so this is a little bit about what happens with cities as they get large and small. So what you find, for example, what you see here are wages in American cities, and they're about almost 50 years of data. And so what you find is something I think you know intuitively, which is large cities, so here's New York, are more, so this is, the fact that this line is above this other line means that per capita wages are higher, and they do so in this systematic way. This is a log-log plot, so it's a formula like this. And so what this means is that when you double the size of a city, people earn more money on average by about 16%. So it's kind of interesting. This is in some sense the effect that makes Mumbai and Delhi and maybe Ahmedabad be more expensive than cities that are smaller. So you tend to see this effect, both in terms of what people make in terms of money, but also the money that they spend. This is for GDP. I'd love to have Indian cities there, and there have been some estimates of GDP, but I don't think I trust them. And so you see there a bunch of cities from, I think, 10 countries or something in 4 continents. But you see a similar thing. You also see China, which is are the gray dots, is kind of a bit of a mess. But nevertheless, again, the GDP, so the total economy, which includes wages and the profits that companies make and so forth, tends to be higher in larger cities, which is, again, interesting. It has to go with wages, of course. But it tells you that some things that are being done in larger cities that are just different and have more value. And this is for other quantities like patents and violent crime. So it seems that this is really an effect of interactions of people in cities. This is for Europe. In the interest of time, I'm going to go a little quicker. But you get that these effects kind of are there for many different cities in many different places. This is maybe an interesting one. I think you sort of know it here, Ahmedabad being a bit of a university town. But when you go to Mumbai or Delhi, you know that there are a lot of people working in government, a lot of people working in finance, a lot of people working in the arts, a lot of people working in management. So you tend to find that this index, which an economist in the US called super creative professionals, of course, he's included in that, so you have to, maybe there should be a different word, but that the quality of employment, the kind of things that people do as a proportion of population change with the size of cities. And so the role that larger cities play in a system of cities tend to have these properties of management and innovation and creativity and technical sort of connecting activities. So in some sense, it's this transformation you see that started creating a horizon for development and change in cities, and that you see it in this way. So what happens is that there are 2 effects. So there's the effect that I've been showing you here, which is wealth increases with the size of the city. But there's this other effect that's very interesting, which is speaking to the fact this is the area of roads in American cities. And so what you find is that this line now is below the other line, which means that there are fewer roads per person, less road surface per person in larger cities. So there's more congestion, and there's basically an amount of infrastructure that needs to service more people In many ways, this is good. It means that you have an economy of scale if you're a provider of this. But it means that infrastructure takes a lot of beating because there are a lot of use. There's more use per capita. There's more use in general of this infrastructure in larger cities. So it needs more maintenance and so forth. So there's a paper I wrote some time ago that explains how this works. So let me just go through that. So there's Mumbai, and the idea is how do you bring together people with the background of all the infrastructure and services that you kind of see in this picture. It's a famous picture that was in National Geographic some time ago. So what we need to do, so a lot of what I've been telling you is that what we need to do in some sense is understand how spatial design and space and the structure space of cities is integrated with a social network that this is trying to show you of how people relate to each other and how different people, in fact, relate to each other. So we're going to put our hero, which was there before in terms of all the things she needed to do, back in space. And so you can imagine your life a little bit through this thought exercise, that as you go around your day in Ahmedabad, you come here maybe part of the day, but you go and do different things in the streets of the city. So this is what the streets mean, and these are occupied spaces, obviously not an Indian city, but an American city with straight blocks. But, you know, you go around and you do things that change your condition. You may catch a disease, you may find someone you love, you spend money, you learn something. But this is in some sense the way to model how a life works and things that get accumulated or not. And you can do a little calculation as to how this happens depending on the rates of encounters that you have in this structured space. So this also tells you, if you see it from the other way around, as maybe you do from the point of view of space, maybe there's something you can do about space to improve this, right? To make encounters more likely or the good things more likely than the bad things. So in a larger city, what happens is that the infrastructure gets bigger, but the density, as I was showing you for roads, increases. So you can do more per unit time. In an Indian city, sometimes that feels overwhelming because there's just too much to do, right? It's too unstructured, at least to me. Sorry, I'm not used to it. But the point is that if you can choose what you're doing, you can do more things per unit time. And so all these effects of wealth creation and spending and encounters of all kinds accelerating over time have to do with this compression of space and time that cities achieve. So I just want to tell you a little bit how this happens, because now we have a lot of information about this, and it's interesting from the point of view of planning. So here's a little town, okay, these are roads, houses, and here's the space between them. This is actually an Aztec real town. But part of the idea is, you know, when we look at density in cities, it's really a hard problem. There are people writing about high density being good or high density being bad. And if you look at density in different cities, for example, New York City, if you have a thought of New York City, you have rich people living at very high densities and rich people living at very low densities. And, you know, density is not so much always correlated with the condition of people. But this is kind of a more aggregate picture where you start asking, you know, why is the space of a city structured like this? And to give you a sense of where those formulas come from, I just want to ask, you know, why isn't it bigger? Why isn't it smaller? And so the idea is that if the function of the city is for people to meet each other now and then I don't know if you like math, but basically it means that that GDP is proportional to the number of people times the density, so the number of people over area, okay? And this is just to make it into money from encounters. And so if you equate the number of encounters that you have versus the cost of moving around, just proportional to the length, then you get these expressions. So again, it's this effect. There's densification, and then there's basically an acceleration of encounters and socioeconomic production. And so these effects really are mirror effects of each other, and they support each other. And what's interesting about them is that if you change, for example, the cost of transportation, which is this little parameter C, so if you make it, for example, less expensive, then that usually means that the area of the city can increase. So the city kind of extends itself, which is a little bit already, even in Indian cities, what's happening with this growth of peripheries, is that people can drive now, even with all the traffic. And so there's, in some sense, this is happening, and as is happening everywhere. But cities, now I want to make a point that, as you'll see, plays out very importantly when you look at cities with large informal neighborhoods, and that that poses a problem of development. So this is my native city. Actually, I was born not in the U.S. but in Portugal, and so you know, India looms very large in Portugal. It's sort of interesting. We have a lot of bits of food and things that are hard to know, but they are there. But Lisbon, this is around the time actually that our countries became connected. This is a map of that time, and I like maps. But the point about this is that you see that space is structured now in terms of streets and in terms of blocks of buildings, right? And if you look at any city, this is an urban universal. You always find that people live in places, but they have to be able to walk out of their door onto a street and go to another building, right? And if you think about it, this is necessary, at least when you reach a certain density, because otherwise things just get too clogged and there's no sense of circulation versus presence, so to speak. So this is just going in and emphasizing that point. This is Shanghai. And so what this means is that you may start with something unstructured like this, but the pattern that you see in neighborhoods as they form, with exceptions I'll mention in a second, is that you start aligning buildings and streets around streets. So basically there's a network of circulation like this. And this, I'm not going to show you the math, but basically this turns out that it generates different math with a different number here, which is what we see. So this is kind of interesting that cities go through this structural transformation that create public spaces and places of movement, at least as well as places that can be more private, and, as well as places of work. And this means basically when you put these two properties together, that cities exist within only a small realm of possibilities. If transportation gets, for example, to be too expensive because the city is too extended, then the city falls apart into smaller villages, and that's what happens often in American cities. They're very dispersed, particularly in places like Florida. But you can also be sort of in a situation that's maybe a little bit more familiar, where it's all too dense and nothing moves, and that the city also falls apart because you cannot move and make contacts across the city. So probably in many Indian cities, entire cities like Mumbai cannot exist as a whole because it's just too hard to go across it. Okay, so what this means is that this predicts a bunch of things about cities that are interesting, but in the interest of time, let me go a little faster and just show you the pictures. So one of the things it predicts is that the amount of infrastructure that you create grows faster than the surface area of a city. And so you're just starting to see this in India. And so I kind of take great joy when I go through an Indian city to see it, where it happens. So you will see that a lot of roads that are being built now, the new ones, often have overpasses, right? And you're building metro systems. And so what happens is that the infrastructure needs to go somewhere and cannot be on the surface. You don't have any space anymore. And this is what happens in every city. If you think about any developed city has these properties, you start having to go into the third dimension. So these are pipes, which of course you need a lot of in India. Mumbai in particular is sort of my little crusade that somebody needs to fix that. This is of course more like an American city, but Indian cities are doing this. And this is kind of a joke, but you sometimes see this in India too. This is Rio, and it's an informal neighborhood where of course there's not much engineering going on, but people are just getting connections and the network is just taking over, right? It's almost natural, right? It's beautiful. Okay, in New York, this is an example that's actually the story of when this happened, because on the left, you see that all these crazy things. Of course, it's a drawing. It probably looked more like Rio. But then in New York, of course, there was an ice storm. So there was ice that got on the cables and everything fell to the ground. So at that moment, they decided to put it underground, and now if you go to New York, you don't see any cables. So to be done in India, right? But again, in places where it's very dense, you need to find ways to use the public spaces and the surface for the things that are most valuable, and to find ways to use your infrastructure in other places. This is the Hong Kong way, which I'm not sure you're going to do, but it's a way. This requires something as well that I don't see being done much in India, perhaps in private compounds and so forth, which is that if you do this, so if you do, for example, what Singapore has done with its infrastructure and public housing, it requires immense attention and detail to maintenance and to public spaces, because the density is so high that everything breaks all the time. So you need to have like fanatical care to the elevators, to the elevator shafts, and to everything, which requires an attention to commons, which is sort of interesting as an institution, but that really gets expressed in terms of how space is managed. Okay, so home values get very expensive, and so it's very important to capitalize on the value of land as cities grow, because this is actually goes faster than incomes, or because space is being contracted, incomes are going up, so this compounds both effects. Okay, so to summarize this part, much of what happens in cities, the most important thing that we don't know very well how much is happening yet in India, is that this sort of intensification of socioeconomic networks and compression of space actually creates a change in how people work and how they live. And what tends to happen is that people become more interdependent on the knowledge and labor of others. This is how societies, particularly rich societies, acquire more knowledge, is that people end up doing different things. They get specialized, so this is called in division of labor, if you wish, but division of knowledge in a modern society. And so what you find in poor societies is that everyone does a lot of the same thing, and that knowledge is very small because everyone's being a farmer, or everyone is basically, building or doing more basic work. Whereas you see it here in this audience, but effectively, as you get educated in more advanced things and things that a society can start to use. And this is the way the knowledge in a society becomes distributed, but it needs to be connected back together to work. And that's why cities are so important. They're the places where people who are very different can actually be connected to realize enterprises that have a lot of value and they're very unlikely as combinations of knowledge and capabilities. Okay, so a message from this part, and then I'll quickly finish, is essentially that we don't know a lot about Indian cities. And part of the reason for me to be in India, I was just in Delhi before coming here, I was talking to the Planning Commission and other people in government as well as in academia, is that if India is going to do well by its urbanization, it needs to know more about its cities. It needs to know more about if things are improving or getting worse. And I think at the moment, certainly at the level of cities, at the level of neighborhoods, there's immense data gap, immense information gap. And we often think we know, but we really don't know, right? You're all professionals and you know that often we don't know even why the most basic things are not working or why they keep failing. So what cities to grow, to be better, need to do is to accumulate knowledge, to distribute it, and be able to use it in sort of a virtuous cycle of change. And that is very hard to do beyond a certain point spontaneously. You need to create the mechanisms as well as the information to do that. So this is something I'm talking to several people in India as I travel as to who's trying to do what and whether there are plans to do this. And if any of you is interested, I'd love to talk more. Okay. So the last thing I want to say is about work that tries to fill a bit of this gap. It's more of an example rather than really a solution, which has to do with how is it that we actually go into places in the city that we know nothing about, and we try to find solutions that create open-ended urban development, as I mentioned. So I want to start basically with this problem, okay? In some sense, I showed you quickly an image for the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a commitment, I don't know if all of you know about this, but India and every other country on earth is committed to, by 2030, basically solve all the great problems of humanity, including poverty, services, justice, and many others, to a certain standard. No country is being told exactly how to do that, but in some sense is committed to do it. And if you look at a lot of where these problems are compounded, certainly in terms of services, in terms of lack of institutions, in terms of poverty, they tend to be increasingly concentrated in slums, in cities. So if you actually estimate how many slums, just to put a number to it, there are about 1 million across the world, and India has about 1/5 of that number, about 200,000. That's a rough number. We can go out and count them. It's been done in some cases, but that's roughly the number, okay? And it's known that if you're going to even upgrade a slum to put services, street fronts, and so forth, it takes about 2 years to do that, and that doesn't count the political process. And so that's 2 million years, and that's not, 13 years. So basically, you need to find, again, a different kind of solution, not a solution that's incremental one by one, but a solution that's able to create the means to create good solutions, but also to create them quickly. So this is just, again, an estimate of the work to be done. So worldwide, about this number per year. And this is the amount of money at a minimum that would cost just to upgrade those slums, not the overall urban infrastructure, which costs several times that. But that's a rough number. And it's smaller than it's less than 1% of urban GDP, of the world GDP. So in terms of it being affordable, it's completely affordable, but you need the will and the means to do it. But in India, I just tried to put some numbers down. I gave these numbers by the Planning Commission, so they're probably not completely wrong. But this would be the number. I don't know how many slums or neighborhoods that need upgrading you have in Ahmedabad, but you probably have a few hundred, I'm guessing. And this is the number for India overall. So this is very comparable, for example, with the Smart Cities initiative that the government started. And it's, again, a number a little bit below 1% of GDP. Okay, so that's the money. But most important, how do you do it? So I know that some of you are involved in very similar work, but let me tell you a little bit how I got involved in this and some of the things that we're using in trying to put just a little bit of technology in places where people are using mapping and social organization of communities in order to identify these problems, but then also plan. So there's something called Open Reblock, which is basically how do you introduce streets into a neighborhood that doesn't have streets. Remember that I was telling you that in every city, buildings are by streets, and this is the way you get sanitation or an ambulance. But in fact, in slums, that's not true, right? You cannot bring an ambulance or a fire truck if there's an issue. People don't have an address, and people don't have sanitation typically. So in some sense, these problems can be compounded and solved together. And we've tried to find ways to analyze maps and propose minimal street networks that then can be edited by people. The open refers to open software that if you Google for this, you'll find. So we work a lot with Slum Dwellers International. I know some of you work with Spark and some of their affiliates in India. And for a while now, in the work we do together and the work they do in communities, people are increasingly mapping places that are informal that really we've not seen before. This is an image from India. People often use, cardboard and paper to try to make these maps. But maps are kind of magical. They put people together, thinking together about the same thing. And I don't know how much you work with this, but OpenStreetMaps is a magical thing. It's just this collaborative map like Wikipedia. And increasingly, you're seeing bits of cities that nobody's ever seen before. This is from South Africa, and it is sort of a township. So you see shack by shack. This is part of an enumeration. You also see where the services are being delivered by the city. So here's water and sanitation by the road, because the city cannot get in, because there are no accesses. But you see that the bar, of course, is in the middle. So where people locate things centrally that they can and that they use, but the services struggle to get in. And so what we've been doing, this is the same neighborhood, is to create ways to automatically use a little bit of algorithmic analysis to identify which places need to be connected. So this is just a visual way to show you which of these buildings, little shacks, needs to be are most isolated. You need to cross most number of parcels to get in. So you can do this automatically over a large fabric of cities. You can identify block by block the amount of connections that they need, and then you can go in and basically see, this is kind of not easy to see, but this is already an extended street network. Looks a little strange because this is minimal, creates a lot of cul-de-sacs, a lot of dead ends. But this is sort of the minimal amount of road and street that you need to create. So you have a sense, a first estimate of how much that is very quickly just through computer analysis. And then the idea, what we're working harder on, is to create basically an interface for this that people can edit. So you can go in and say, I don't like it there, or there's some obstacle, I'm going to put it here, and then this thing recomputes how much you need to build, and you can keep discussing until maybe everyone can agree, okay? And then you can keep extending essentially the street network to create more connectivity, and you can keep on computing how much that is. But this also shortens distances, for example, for a commercial street or something. So the point about this is that these maps can be used not only to characterize situations, they've been used a lot, but they can increasingly be used for planning. So this is not to replace the planner by a robot. Hopefully the planner just moves upstream a little bit. But it's the idea that a kind of spatial analysis that seemed impossible in the past because it looked so complicated, it's possible to do with a little bit more analysis that opens up many new solutions. So this is a project that we're doing in Mumbai and in Cape Town that we hope to roll out in more places, but we're working a lot now on the interface that allows people to edit the map together with their cities and create solutions that way. And by the way, this is kind of a plot from an old city in Spain, but it shows you how it's very rare that we have maps like this, but you see how the urban fabric of the same blocks basically has evolved from having cul-de-sacs and no access to having a lot of little lanes where access is now possible and people get water and sanitation. So a lot of the urban fabric is actually moving all the time, is that we don't see it, but has this general characteristic of sometimes increasing connectivity when needed. Okay. So that was my talk. I just want to say a few words about sort of our new adventure and maybe possibilities for working together. So already Professor Chandra told you where I'm coming from. This is a new institute at the University of Chicago. And in many ways, what it's meant to do is to really push the scholarship of what we know about cities, but also the practice and also the tools. So we want, above all, to create sort of an international community of people that know a lot about cities, that are passionate about cities, and that are trying to create change, so that they can come together and learn from each other. So we're trying to nucleate a bit of a peer-to-peer network. this was already said, but this is a major new initiative at the university. The university wants to play a role in this and to create both the scholarship and practice that makes a difference. And importantly, the university also has a New Delhi center as of a couple of years ago. And so we're committed to being in India, and from an urban perspective, my own perspective, as I said, India is absolutely critical. It has to work. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very fast. But we want to work with people who are doing great work in India, maybe some of you, and to, through you, understand the reality of what happens, but also create some of the data and the tools and the change that is needed from a perspective of creating great cities and a sustainable world. So thank you.
Questions, anyone?
So you showed us those relationships between GDP and density and so on and so forth. Where would you place governance of cities in measurements of these kinds? I know there is a definitely correlation. But while doing studies of this kind, because much of cities, especially, I mean, we know of Indian cities, the story of governance varies from city to city.
Right.
Is there a way of plugging that in?
You mean the role of governance in changing those relationships or in exploiting them?
Yeah, well, either of them.
Well, okay, so I think in India, we don't even have good evidence. It's very hard to say what the GDP of Ahmedabad is. I think there are some estimates at the district level. But so government can and should create better information. I think the role of governance can sometimes hamper the performance of a city. That's not news. But in many ways, within the same system, within India, say, India is special because it's a continent and it's very diverse and it's very large. But nevertheless, I think that you'll find, for example, safety is very different in parts of India for the data that exists. So there are parts of India, either through culture or government, that are a lot safer than others. So that's a relationship that this doesn't work for India. But I think what these relationships tell you something very general that I kind of alluded through, but this gives me an opportunity to say, which is that growth is an opportunity because all these things are happening, but you have to plan for them. So it means that your infrastructure is going to be, if you don't expand, it's going to be very congested, and you have to find ways to exploit new kinds of infrastructure going underground and overground in order to make a city work. Otherwise, the city falls apart and doesn't realize all this potential. I think a lot of Indian cities are starting to have an intuition for this, but you can be much more systematically about it. This gives you some prediction for it, both the deficit and what may happen as the city grows. And secondly, this relationship between, for example, economic value being really amplified and land becoming scarcer really points to some of the most successful models by which cities have grown in the past, which the critical thing to do often is, and there are many examples of this in practice in different ways, is that as a city expands, if the city or the government or some civic mechanism exists for capitalizing that land and using some of that value to improve the infrastructure and services, you have a model that can scale up quickly and produce a lot of change quickly and much better services. If that link is broken, it's very hard to create better services, better government, better infrastructure, because you're not going to get the revenues and they're going to get appropriated by somebody else and creates a lot of inequality, and the whole thing is bad. So we know this from history, but I think this kind of data allows you to really have a better expectation for what you might expect and how to create a program and an implementation that can be scalable and really create maybe the infrastructure that a large city in India needs pretty quickly. Usually, if you can capture that value, cities have always been a great investment. Some of the great fortunes in India to be made, but even the present ones, but even, as you know, unfortunately, our president in the United States made a lot of money in real estate. Real estate is easy to make money out of if the conditions are there that create that value. And it's important that a city, civic organizations, government, for the public good, capture that value. such that they create a city that works well.
So one of the things that you mentioned was that there's a lot of loopholes in the data that exists.
Yeah.
And it's getting increasingly cheaper to generate that data. Right? So far, one of the issues was that cost of getting the data was expensive. It's getting cheaper now. To me, the conundrum seems to be the fact that what kind of data would you start to collect first? And how would you really use that data to better plan or determine what comes next?
It depends a little bit on the question, right? I think I had a slide about that. I'm not sure if I can go get it, but I think that this is an example of a laundry list, okay? This is just for that part of the talk, and this is sort of a general sense of performance of the city. Even if you look at the Smart Cities Initiative, cities have to have a table that has a bunch of these things in. But if you look at how they got it from national surveys, and they have to do some magic to get the number to that scale. So it's not very good. I think it would be very interesting if, I don't know if this is possible, but with all this going on, with India feeling that it has a much more urban identity and a stake in the future, that there's a national statistical effort to do this. I think you can leapfrog a lot of older methods and be innovative. I think you'd have a lot of help from people like us, but people like OECD statistics that are doing a lot of work with cell phone data for commuting and for transportation. There are a lot of opportunities. I think from the point of view of delivering infrastructure and services, as I showed you, mapping is now easy at a small scale, and if you do many of these in parallel, you get an entire city. I think Ahmedabad's been doing this, from what I hear. So that's becoming possible, but you need to do the pieces up to a certain standard. So OpenStreetMaps is just an example. I'm not saying that's a high enough standard, but it's a platform that forces you into a standard. And then if you map locally, you can do a little bit, I can do a little bit, and you get an entire thing. For other quantities, it's much harder. The GDP of a city is very hard to get, but wages, you can get a survey. You know, so some socioeconomic things are harder in general, but there are a lot of surveys out there. They're not being integrated or compared or validated. So ideally, you'd like to create an environment where people can exchange data and cross-validate it and compare methods, and then have both a bottom-up and a top-down way of bringing all that together. But that's very hard to do, except with this sort of platform that's emerging.
So do you think where it's done on a smaller scale, so cities like Singapore, city-states, Singapore, which are small, and where they have been able to test bed some of these things,
right?
Does it then extend to larger?
It's interesting you ask that. I work a bit with Singapore, and I advise them in some of their planning. And as you might imagine, in Singapore, the government can know a lot about you, right? And you know, it's just not India, and it's not many other places. But even then, in Singapore, what's interesting is that some data are considered sensitive. So, for example, income data is considered sensitive, and it's only in the last few years, through being more conscious about these issues and so forth, that data is being integrated across agencies. So before it wasn't. There were sort of spatial maps with zoning for master planning and so forth, but this is not integrated with socioeconomic data. And it was not integrated also with services data. So even if you have the data, that some of it was being created, the integration of these different dimensions, they're all important for this human-centric perspective, is typically hard to do. Some of this is known as data, that cities are data shy, often because they think that maybe there's something wrong with the data or something bad can happen and they don't want to share. But in some cases, it just doesn't exist. I think in India, often it just doesn't exist yet. But, you know, to your point, just to conclude that, it'd be very interesting to think about a new but systematic way to do this in India in a way that scales up and fills the gaps in a modern way using technology.
Hi. Great presentation. Thank you. And I appreciate your background in science and then coming to this field. My question is, so your point, I think, is dead on that we need more data for Indian cities and probably other places too. But what about the issue, can you speak a little bit about the issue of not knowing what to do with the data? Because
sure,
we have a lot in places like the United States, and I don't think we do such a great job of analyzing it well or interpreting it well. So how do we bring that
right
in along with the actual data?
That's a great question. So I think, I often tell my students this, so this is less to do with this data that we're given, but, data should always be future oriented. You should want information to solve a problem that you think is an important problem. So I think in the spirit of the question before as well, what are the problems and what do we need? Otherwise you can spend all your time looking at data, generating data. A lot of data that does exist for cities, for example, by city agencies, is not data that anyone particularly is interested in. It's just there. And a lot of social media and cell phone data is sort of just there. And people over time have found interesting things to do with it, but it's not necessarily what you would have wanted if you wanted to solve a problem. So I think you're right, but as you can see, even data that was collected for all kinds of purposes at least can be built upon and constitutes a basis for understanding things that people don't foresee. So on the one hand, I think it's better to have more information, but if you're so constrained and it's so precious and so difficult, I think it's really important to have a strategic exercise about what problems need to be solved first and what is the realm of data that you need to collect. A lot of, for example, this data for neighborhoods on a small scale is coming together through a bunch of collaborations from NGOs, to technologists, to OpenStreetMaps people, but increasingly what's interesting is that it's been this work of planning and understanding neighborhoods, and particularly poorer places, that's been forcing OpenStreetMaps to include categories of services and all kinds of things that's generating maps that are much closer to the experience of living in a place. So it's being forced a little bit, but often, it's most productive if you come at it with a question that's a big question that's quite open-ended and then ask what you need to do. I don't know the answer exactly. I think maybe that's place dependent, but sort of as a scientist, I hope you understand that it's good to have data by which also you can compare places. Even from just a political perspective, where you can say Ahmedabad is doing better than Mumbai on this and not on that. Because that also can force a comparison that stimulates people sometimes to do better and so forth. So without that, we're flying blind a little bit. And I think at the level of speed and precision that this transformation needs to happen in India, it's just not quite good enough. I mean, some things we know what to do, but nevertheless, I think you could do a lot better if you had more information. Singapore is a good example in another way. I struggle a lot, if I have a minute. Just an interesting example that's a counterexample to what I was saying. So for example, I think Singapore is very successful with their public housing program. And if you know about it, you know a little bit about how it works, but a lot of the population lives in public housing. They look just like those towers. So my question to them when I met people from the Housing Design Board was, does towers look just like the towers we have in the United States or in England, and it's a disaster there? How come yours work, right? From perspective of spatial design, you could think, it's the same. And I asked many times, and people that were in my committee were asking, how do you make this work? How do you make this work? Where's the data? Where's the data? No data. They do a survey once a year or something, no data. So at some point I just asked them, how do you know it's working? How do you know that things are not broken? And they just told me, I just know. What do you mean you just know? I just know. They're there every day. It's the same civil servant that's there every day. They have a passion for doing things really well. They're in that place for many years, and they really know it. But it's a model that's very rare in terms of civil service, that people are so passionate for precision, they stay with the problem, and they make it work sort of with a personal touch. So this is a question that, to your point, sometimes you don't need data, of course. You could just have somebody that, in fact, has the information and makes it work. But in systems where people move a lot, or there's no permanence, there's no collective memory, which they do have because of that structured civil service, then you need some continuity and some way to accumulate knowledge. And this is where maybe sometimes technology can be very useful.
Hello, sir. Good evening. I'm Anurag Gupta. My question is, during the talk, I have seen that you have used a lot of formulas to calculate the data, which actually goes above my mind. But I want to know, how you develop such scientific equations to analyze the relation between various parameters of urbanization. Because, being a student, we always see some data, we analyze it, and then we give some strategies or formulate it.
Right.
And we, most of the time, we complain that we don't have certain ways to calculate through data. So if you can just share some of the ways through which the students can do some exercise and they can develop such equations to understand it. Like why this question arises in my mind because in the morning I've read an article on was it today's newspaper where it says that India has recently submitted its report on how they are performing as SDGs. First goal of poverty. But that report does not say anything about how we are performing better.
Right.
So if I want to calculate the performance on poverty,
Right.
what are those variables I should look for? And
Right.
how I should develop that equation and understand
Okay.
that.
I may have to talk about the entire answer later, because those are big questions, they're important questions. To the first one, you know, even though they're formulas, it's always basically a question that you're asking of the data. And the kind of formulas I showed you just ask, you know, does the city change as the population is larger or smaller? And then all that you should always do is an XY plot, right? You plot the thing you're interested in, like maybe it's GDP, maybe it's the amount of crime, maybe it's the amount of infrastructure versus population, and you may get a relationship. So in some sense, it's a very simple idea. This comes from a whole background of people doing this sort of thing in other sciences, in other fields. It comes all the way from physics, where the air in this room has an energy and a pressure, and a few other quantities that are proportional to the number of particles, so to the mass. So that's a simple thing, nothing happens, right? More air is more or less the same thing, if density is constant. But what happens in a lot of more interesting systems, it happens, for example, in ecosystems, and interestingly happens in cities, is that as the size of the system, at least as measured by people, changes, something qualitatively different happens. So you get more economic value, you get less infrastructure per capita. And so that's very interesting. So that's the idea, is that XY plots as a first pass are very interesting because they tell you how one thing varies with another, and they're worth doing if you suspect that they're connected. Then you may have to do something more sophisticated if things are all entangled. But that's part of the ingredient. To the second one, the poverty. Poverty, as you know, is very contentious and difficult to measure. The Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals have usually measures that are a little bit imperfect. I mean, they're very imperfect, but they're imperfect in a specific sense that they try to measure a certain level of income and who's below it. I don't know how India did it exactly, but that number was very low for the Millennium Development Goals, $1.25 a day per person. And so by that, probably most people in India, most people in cities in India may be above poverty level, but that's the number. So you have to know that that's the line. I think that with all the problems that we have throughout the world and in India, it is true that a lot of people are coming out of poverty, at least at this very basic extreme poverty, but at the same time, it's probably fair to say that they remain poor. But what you see in these numbers is people exiting extreme poverty, measuring by a pretty low bar number. So it's good. It's good that that change is happening, but you should dig into it and understand what the bar is that says that India is doing better or worse.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the way in which the functioning and structure of the urban environment is different in India compared to perhaps most other places in the world. Given the sort of number of people or the volume of people that tend to be there in order to make something happen, in other words, tend to be more people producing an effect, for example, in a household in an urban environment where in other countries a lot of people would do the stuff for themselves, whereas here you might have somebody coming to the door every day. One person might be collecting used newspapers, one person, or maybe even two people might be doing some gardening or watering of plants. Some, functioning of machinery would have a lot of different people affecting it. Instead of one delivery, you might have perhaps 10 deliveries. And and then also the whole thing of the presence of household servants at a much higher proportion compared to most other countries. How does that affect the structure of the urban environment?
Right. So it's both an urban environment question, but also a sort of an economics question, right? Well, it's more than that, but it's certainly that too. In many ways, this is an indication that labor is relatively inexpensive, so that things that are quite basic can be done by people, and somehow they make a living, right? Which is somehow is true, but it's hard to fathom from somebody living in the United States. So what tends to happen with development is that people do different things. Some of the very basic, the condition of poverty, as I sort of indicated with the plot that was a bit little abstract, is that you have a lot of people doing the same thing. It's very low skilled jobs, and there's a lot of redundancy, many people that can do that job, and therefore people are not paid much. So it's a state that's very stable, but for them and for society, it doesn't generate very high incomes. But it can persist, of course. What often happens even as you develop even infrastructure in some cases, services like water or sanitation or electricity that allows you to run appliances, is that some of that labor is no longer necessary, or, you know, and people substitute that by automation and services and all kinds of things. And people hopefully can move on to a different activity, repairing those appliances or whatever it is. So that's usually what you see with development, is that people have to acquire skills in order to deal with the change. It's not always a good thing, but in the end tends to create more value in labor and a rise in standards of living. And importantly, I think an aspect that's not purely economic is that if you spend most of your day dealing with very basic things, then you have no time to invest and learn and so forth, and you're tired. So that kind of locks you into a condition of poverty that is perfectly replaceable by some urban services, but that if doesn't allow the society to bootstrap itself. So there are many aspects to this that are interesting. I think that, as you know from India, is a state that can persist, but it leaves a lot of people with very basic incomes and a lot of a labor-intensive, improvised, relatively low-skill environment, which you know has its good things, but also its not so good things. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your talk. I had two quick questions. First one being about if you could elaborate a little more on how we could take an ethnographic approach to understanding what people living in that city want, and how could we go about developing a city around that. And the second one being more about the point, about the cobra effect, or unintended consequences of our designs.
Right.
For example, the housing projects or the pollution problem. So, two questions.
Okay, so those are also very good questions and could be a long answer. But to the first one, I think ethnographies often are very important. They're closer maybe to the human experience. And there can be a rich set of evidence about, you know, somebody's life or somebody's condition or somebody's, or maybe a community. I think the problem of ethnographies is that, so that's the advantage, and I think they're a rich body of knowledge and work that's important. The disadvantage is that they can be anecdotal, and they're very hard to do on a larger scale, so you may worry if you're representing enough people with enough scope to solve a problem. But that may depend on the question. I'm a fan of ethnographies. I learn a lot from them, particularly in places where we don't have a lot of evidence on a larger scale, but they're not necessarily a replacement when you want to create solutions on a larger scale to do that. But I think they're very important to keep in the system, and they definitely have a role. For the second one, the whole, in some sense I didn't say that explicitly, but the whole idea of having this systems view of the city and systems view of somebody's life is exactly to try to not fall into the trap of unintended consequences, right? A lot of urban policy and attempts at planning are full of unintended consequences, from public housing, solving one problem like sanitation and decent housing, but then creating dislocation, destruction of livelihoods, destruction of social networks, in some sense freezing somebody in a different state of poverty that's not maybe so destitute in material terms, but it's a trap to many, many other things that are issues. So you have, in some sense, this is partly why you need to have this framework, this theory, if I may, of how a city works, where all these things are connected, and to have it in a sense that you want to always have the perspective that people have to have capabilities that are accessible to them, and not to freeze them in a situation that solves a simple problem but creates a more complex one. So if you are in a small frame, you may do that, but if you're in a bigger frame, you would say, no, you know, it's a bad idea to create a lot of public housing very far away from the city, because even though that solves one problem, it's going to create a huge problem later on that you need to plan for example. But there are many such examples. And it has to do a lot with the planner thinking that they're solving a problem once and for all with a simple design, versus the planner thinking that they're working within a process of change and trying to interfere in that process to make it be better or faster or more successful in some way, but not creating a design that's close-ended, rather to work with these virtuous cycles of change in just the right ways that somebody's livelihood can improve because you provide a better service, but you don't destroy that livelihood just to provide the service. That's a question.
Hello. So you mentioned about the requirement of data, which is lacking as far as India is concerned. So there's a serious lack of data due to which we're not able to do the right kind of planning. But at the same time, you also mentioned about the complexities. So how do you address those complexities? Because at times you don't have, these complexities come in the way of, you getting the right kind of data. And
right.
So how do you address, you mentioned about upgradation of urban slums taking lot of time, right? So you have to have strategies even if you don't have data. So how do you address that?
Right. It's data and information, but to your point, I mean, you'll never get enough data to have a full complexity of a city or a life of a person, right? So you shouldn't think that data is going to solve that problem of knowing that completely. But if you want to know, I don't know, that air quality is improving, or that more people have decent water, or that their services are working, or that people are saving time and are healthier, then you may need some data to give you an indication that that's really happening and that's systematic and it's happening across enough of a population. So in some sense, what I'm trying to say is that data is a tool towards creating change that goes in the right direction, that's not necessarily exactly prescriptive, but it goes in the right direction, and that accumulates. Otherwise, you may have an impression of change that may not be real, or it's just for some people and not others, and people will tell you that they know the answer, but nothing happens. So you need to create situations that are as objective as possible, such that you can improve on them. So that the simplicity that data provides should be used with care, but with care could be used to move the needle on some issues. I mean, in the work that I showed you towards the end of the talk on slums, another role of data, it's not quite data, it was just the mapping, and which is a form of data, but it's rich, was really to create a coordination device, a coordination mechanism between often the communities and the city governments. Because often, particularly in situations of informality, there's a conflict, right? Communities are in some situation of lack of tenure or risk. The city doesn't necessarily like them, and finds them a burden. And so you need to create a situation where both stakeholders that may be at logheads find that they accept the same reality and the same problems and accept that those need a solution. And then perhaps if it's a spatial problem, can work on a solution that they can both see and see that's the same. We found in earlier work that we had done that if you create that information, if you create information about the problems of a neighborhood, but that it's not verifiable by somebody in the city because it's not spatialized or whatever, it's much harder to have that dialogue because people say, you have a cause, I don't trust you, how do I know? And that doesn't so much advance the cause. So data often has this important role as well of creating a certain objectivity and potentially creating agreements and opening up consensus for a solution. But again, data per se doesn't do that. It has to be within a process and it has to be the right thing and then has that potential. So you need to know how to use it, but your point's well taken.
May I request Professor Srivatsan to give the vote of thanks?
When Bimal a few weeks back said we are inviting Professor Bettencourt, I was wondering, in a curious, positive way, what a physicist could offer towards urbanization. We had an engaging conversation before the presentation where he explained both individually and through his institution what kind of bridges he's making. And this presentation that followed had very concrete examples of that could be done or has been done. And I really appreciate, I'm sure many of you would agree, unlike some presentations which are based on data could be deterministic, his presentation was open showed how data could be analytical, generative, insightful, and above all, empowering. Thank you, Professor Bettencourt, for this impressive presentation, and we look forward to collaborating in future. Also like to thank Professor Pankaj Gupta from the Ahmedabad University for setting up this CEPT AU lecture series. And thank you all for coming, and I look forward to seeing you in our next presentation. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.